Judas Iscariot in the Bible is a symbol of how end-time churchgoers are going to betray us, you and me, for 30 digital dollars. Judas listened to Jesus' messages for 3.5 years, went on mission trips with the disciples when they were sent out 2 by 2. He was even an officer in the early assembly of believers. He was their treasurer. But he betrayed Jesus, and the other 11 brought soldiers to their prayer meeting and sold them out for 30 pieces of silver. It's a central feature of Holy Week and the salvation Jesus won for us on the cross. But why is betrayal a central feature? Jesus tells us our fellow Christians are going to sell us out and betray us as well in these last days. And many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Matthew 24:10. Jesus' main command for his followers is to love one another, not betray one another. But Judas heard that command as well, yet, as we know, he ignored it. But when push comes to shove in the end times, as events in our nations become more severe, the Judases among us will betray one another, their fellow churchgoers, and even hate one another. This is like the hardest thing for me to wrap my head around in regard to the end times. I can understand the unregenerate outside the church hating us, but those who are sitting alongside you in the pews, or even our pastors and elders, the officers in our churches, I have a much harder time accepting that. But that's what Jesus tells us is going to happen. And quietly, this last weekend, part of this sellout began as the USA stealthily moved to unveiling the precursor of its new digital dollar. And the end of financial freedom and the start of totalitarianism, centralized control. Did you know that? It didn't make mainstream media news. Will our fellow churchgoers sell us out for a symbolic 30 digital dollars? If the Judas metaphor plays out, that will be part of what happens. And that is what we're looking at in today's video. Let's start with the digital dollar rollout. Over the weekend, the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, activated its real-time digital payment system to select customers. We urge financial institutions and their industry partners to move full steam ahead with preparations to join the Federal Now service, said Kent Montgomery, the chief operating officer at the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston. In July, this is going to become available nationwide to everyone. And this is how they boil the frogs slowly, so we don't jump out of the pot as they're cooking us. Once the digital system is in place, this FedNow service, we are one severe financial crisis away from them going full digital currency on us. And that is exactly what I think they're planning to do. I imagine we have already gotten a taste of what that's going to look like in the recent bank crisis and shutdowns when Silicon Valley Bank was failing. It took less than 48 hours, and in one day, consumers withdrew $42 billion from that bank, nearly a quarter of the bank's total deposits. This is known as a bank run. Banks don't have enough cash on hand to pay out the money that's deposited. They only have a fraction of a percent of what's deposited on hand. Now, in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, the Federal Reserve jumped in and saved the bank, and consumer confidence was temporarily restored, but the Federal Reserve has no desire to save the current paper currency system. They want to do away with it. They've said so. The government wants a system where they can monitor and control every single transaction you make. They want to know where you're spending your money and how much. And they want the ability, especially this ability, to shut off your account so you can't buy or sell if you misbehave according to their standards. Trudeau showed this vile side of government in the recent trucker protests where he closed accounts across Canada. And this type of control is what they're going to use to fuel the Judases to betray us. At least that's what I'm guessing. So anyway, the Fed wants to do away with cash. How better to do that than to create a bank run and not bail out the banks? Imagine, let's say, next month, that instead of just a bank in California failing, the government causes a dozen mid-sized banks to begin to fail. Yes, causes. Just like in the Silicon Valley bank failure, there would be a run, but not on one bank, but a dozen. And then that would spread to probably all the banks, probably worldwide. Banks would then shut down for a, quote, bank holiday till they solved the problem. You would literally not be able to withdraw your money from any bank, use bank credit cards, or write checks. Buying and selling would cease for anyone without cash, and prices would skyrocket for those things that you could buy. Panic would set in, and the government will, of course, be there to save us all with their digital dollars, saying the problem was the paper money. You all need your money on your phone, where it'll be available all the time, and you don't have to go to a bank and be told you can't get it out. At that point, everyone is going to line up like sheep to accept their new digital dollars. Of course, it probably is going to take 2 to 3 weeks for the rollout to be complete, and during that time, people will be hysterical. Many will be hungry. The feds want you to be hungry. They want you to remember this crisis forever. We've talked about putting food away for years. If this scenario I just described doesn't get you to do that, I don't know what will, frankly. I mean, even if Jesus told you directly, which he kind of did in Matthew 24, 45 through 46, but I digress. So eventually, they will confiscate your food, but probably not for this crisis, because they want you to go on to the digital dollar. After this, we're all on digital dollars. The Fed converts what's in your account, confiscates your paper money, and your gold. I assume it will soon be illegal to own gold, probably after this event, and gives us digital accounts. I wouldn't be surprised if some equity make good for slavery reparations and even LGBTQ reparations are made. Payoffs, to further divide the nation and make people angry at each other. Okay, now we have our guess at what the future scenario is going to look like in place. If I'm right, I assume this happens late 2023, early 2024. They have to have their infrastructure in place first. And that's what this Fed Now service that they began this weekend is about. Building that infrastructure so they can roll their digital dollars out. But they're going to want to do this rollout, including the bank run, prior to the next USA election, in my opinion, while they have a puppet in the White House. I assume Europe, Canada, Australia are all going to do the same thing at the same time. So wherever you live, this is something to keep your eye out for. One of the top members of our community, Jonathan Merrill, questioned me, why doesn't someone stop them? The reason is they have too much power already, and the people are oblivious to what's being done to them. Remember how the pandemic struck with almost no warning, and the media hyped up the fear, and then lockdowns began to happen, as if the whole world was in lockstep, because they were. Remember how the lockdowns happened as if it was normal. It wasn't normal in any way. And in retrospect, this is what it will be like with the coming financial crisis, at least we assume. Fear, speed, coordination will leave everyone blind to what's being done to them, and it will look like they're just acting in our best interest. Let's now leave the current events and refocus on the topic of this video, betrayal of our churches. Digital currency gives the government the means to bribe lukewarm churchgoers into selling out those sitting to their right and to their left in church. Let's see what Judas did on Holy Week, as it may be a picture of what is coming. He is the symbol of betrayal, after all. So we need to understand his motives. It seems Mary anointing the feet of Jesus was the impetus for Judas's betrayal. Oh, I'm sure he thought of it for a while, but that's what put him over the edge. Judas was upset at Mary's anointing of Jesus, and it's after this we immediately read, "Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?' And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. From that moment on, he sought to betray him." Matthew 26:14-16. So Mary's sacrificial use of the most valuable possession she had, the perfume she used to honor Jesus with, was the spark. This perfume was worth a year's wages, 300 denarii, or 300 payments for 300 days of work. A denarii was the coin given after someone worked a full day's work. So 300 of them is a year's wage. In the USA, the average yearly salary is $1,000 a week, or about $50,000 a year. Look at what the Apostle John has to say about this. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii, 1 year's salary, and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief and used to help himself to what was put into it. John 12:4-6. So personal greed was motivating Judas, masked by a false social concern for the poor. Now, how might this play out in the future? Because I think it can line up just like this. Will greed and a pretended social concern lead to the betrayal of God's faithful in our churches? Imagine how this might play out in an environment of climate change and LGBTQ rights. These two things, especially the latter one, have become a humanistic religion of sorts in much of the world. Those who don't support these things are viewed as part of the problem. Imagine a day when the government rolls out a program of thinking out your neighbors for a price. If you turn in climate deniers or those who refuse to get the mandated vaccines or those saying LGBTQ are wrong, we'll pay you. We need to eliminate these persons from our society. We need a pure society. This is just like what the Nazis did in World War II Germany, after all, with the Jews, only the issue is different. And if it worked out like this, it would be identical to the Judas betrayal. A supposed concern for social factors and a payoff to boot. It would be exactly what Judas got. Now, the chief priest gave Judas only 30 pieces of silver, not 300, which is 1/10 of a year's wage. This is probably more likely what the payoff would be in the USA. In the USA, it would be $5,000, a tenth of $50,000, to turn in your fellow Christians in this imagined scenario. I can see this happening very soon, actually. In the case of the terrorist attack on the Christian school in Nashville, the media is spinning this, that the school is the culprit causing mental illness for the poor trans person who committed the crime. I have seen all sorts of articles this week that those opposed to LGBTQ rights are responsible for the higher suicide rates in this group and their mental illness. They're blaming this horrible crime on the victims. So I can see a program like this in this country, especially after another year, if it becomes more totalitarian, where people are paid in digital credits to rat out those in their own churches, and many churchgoers will feel self-righteous for doing this. Those who believe the media narrative will hate their fellow believers, just as Jesus predicted. They'll hate one another. They will betray one another. They will be greedy for the payout, but they will also want to be good citizens, as defined by the media and the government. What will be the punishment? Of course, this whole scenario is something we're guessing at, but it would be a simple matter to transfer the $5,000 payout from the righteous to the digital account of the betrayer. Digital currency allows for this. It would be a wealth transfer. It would happen in a moment, and you could do nothing about it. Then perhaps they'd threaten the righteous with prison if they don't reform their thinking to match the government's mandates. Now, I know this is speculation, but it is the direction I see the Western nations going. Remember, mandates during a pandemic? Those that didn't wear a mask, didn't stay in lockdown, didn't get the drugs commanded, they were ostracized. Remember the anger many showed toward those who didn't follow the government's ideas, but followed their own ideas, which turned out, after all, to be right. Society is training the susceptible to tell on those not doing what the government asks. What will be the church's reaction to this? Jesus seems to tell us that as well. They'll be asleep, just as the disciples. When Judas came to get Jesus, Judas assembled a group with lanterns and spears to come and get Jesus, a bunch of soldiers, but the disciples were sound asleep. Jesus saw this group coming up the path from Jerusalem, up onto the Mount of Olives, and to the Garden of Gethsemane where they were. Jesus woke the disciples 3 separate times, and they managed to fall back asleep again the first 2 times, totally oblivious to what was coming for them. And this is a perfect picture of the church right now, oblivious to the danger coming up the path towards them. Maybe this is your first wake-up call in this video. Maybe it's your second. Have you considered that? People who sat there thinking they have no need to prepare for the last days, that we should just go on living our best lives now, that there is no need to get ready. They are the ones who are asleep. We need to wake up as many as possible. That's why we have this channel and this ministry, Last Days Overcomers, so people can be awakened. Because this and many other things are coming, folks. These things are coming up the path for us right now. So should we fight back politically, physically? The disciples asked the Lord, "Shall we strike them with the sword?" Jesus answered, "No more of this." Fighting back physically or politically is not Jesus' way. What would have been the disciples' best approach? Jesus said, "Watch and pray, that you not enter into temptation." Mark 14:38. Jesus has told us the betrayal and hatred of those in our churches against us is coming. We aren't going to stop it. Jesus predicted it's coming. Our job is to be spiritually and mentally prepared for what is coming up the path, so when it arrives, we're ready for it, and to act in a manner worthy of Jesus. Last Days Overcomers is holding conferences throughout the USA to help do just that. If you want to attend or support this effort with your dollars, before they're digital, or your volunteer works, a link is down in the description that will take you to lastdaysovercomer.org. I don't know of very many more worthy causes to spend your last days on. But why isn't political activity going to help? Let's get back to that. Can we vote this stuff out? Click right here to keep watching. Watch what the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Bible have to say about how Jesus is going to end this Great Reset nonsense that is coming, and this type of totalitarian measures. What the biblical solution is. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.